The wind was a razor slicing through Jedediah Thorne's worn duster, each gust laden with ice crystals that stung his exposed skin like 1,000 needles. He squinted against the white fury of the blizzard, his horse, Bess, faltering beneath him, her breath pluming in ragged, frosty clouds. Visibility was near zero, the world had been reduced to a maelstrom of white and the keening howl of the storm. He'd been a fool to push on, thinking he could outrun the front, but the plains had a way of humbling even the most seasoned men. Now, survival was a desperate, minute-by-minute calculation. Bess stumbled again, a low groan rumbling in her chest, and Jedediah knew they couldn't go much further. He slid from the saddle, his legs stiff and aching, and grabbed Bess's reins, urging her forward into the blinding chaos. It was then, through a momentary thinning of the swirling snow, that he saw it, a dark, huddled shape against a drift, too small to be a rock, too still to be an animal fighting the elements. Caution, a lifelong companion, warred with a sudden, inexplicable dread. He tied Bess loosely to a skeletal, ice-encased sapling that barely protruded from the snow, drew his Colt, and advanced. The shape resolved itself into a human form, small, wrapped in meager furs. A child. As he drew closer, he saw a face, framed by matted black hair, skin the color of winter earth, tinged with a terrifying blue. Native. A girl, no more than 6 or 7 winters old. Her eyes were closed, lashes dusted with snow. He holstered his pistol, a cold knot tightening in his gut. He knelt, his gloved hand reaching out, then hesitating. What was he doing? His past was a litany of violence against her people, orders followed, duties performed, memories that gnawed at him in the quiet hours. But this was a child, alone and dying. He touched her cheek. Cold as stone. For a moment, he thought she was gone, another ghost to add to his collection. Then, a flicker. Her eyelids trembled, then slowly opened. Dark eyes, vast and ancient, stared up at him, devoid of comprehension, then filled with a primal terror. She expected death, he saw it in the widening of her pupils, the shallow, hitching breath. He was the enemy, the spectre from her people's nightmares. And in that moment, something in Jedediah, something he thought long dead and buried, cracked. He couldn't leave her. He wouldn't. The storm be damned. His own ghosts be damned. He gently, carefully, scooped her small, unnervingly light body into his arms. She was rigid with fear, but too weak to struggle. He turned back towards Bess, the child a fragile burden against his chest. The blizzard raged on, uncaring, but now, there was a different fight to be won. Jedediah fought his way back to Bess, the small girl a silent, cold weight in his arms. The wind shrieked, trying to tear her from his grasp, but he held tight, shielding her small frame with his own body as best he could. He managed to drape a corner of his duster over her, a pathetic defense against the biting cold. Bess whinnied softly, her anxiety palpable. There was a shallow overhang of rock he'd half noticed earlier, a mere indentation in a low bluff, but it was their only hope for a sliver of shelter. He pushed Bess towards it, the horse's strength failing but her will holding. Reaching the meager alcove, barely deep enough to blunt the wind's main force, Jedediah carefully laid the child down on his bedroll, which he quickly unfurled. Her eyes followed his every move, wide with a mixture of fear and a dawning, fragile curiosity. He worked swiftly, gathering what little dry tinder he had in his saddlebags, along with a few larger pieces of wood he'd scavenged earlier, hoping they weren't too green. His fingers were numb, clumsy, but desperation lent them a frantic energy. He built a small fire pit with rocks, shielding it from the worst of the wind-driven snow. Striking a match was an agony of fumbling, the first 2 sputtering out. The third caught, and he cupped it tenderly, feeding the flame to the tinder. It coughed, smoked, then, blessedly, caught. A small, hungry flame began to lick at the kindling. He fed it carefully, watching it grow into a small but vital blaze. Only then did he turn his full attention back to the girl. She was shivering violently now, her teeth chattering. He chafed her small hands between his own, then her feet, trying to restore circulation. He remembered snippets of old survival lore, snow to rub on frostbite was a myth, steady warmth was key. He poured a little coffee from his near-frozen canteen into his tin cup, warmed it by the fire, then carefully brought it to her lips. She recoiled at first, then, smelling the warmth, took a tiny, hesitant sip. Her name, he realized, he didn't know it. He didn't know her tribe, her story. He only knew she was alone, and he was too. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The fine bones of her face, the resilience already etched there despite her youth. He thought of the faces from his past, the ones that haunted his sleep, faces of warriors, of women, of children, caught in the relentless gears of conflict. He'd been a soldier, following orders. An excuse that wore thinner with each passing year. This child, she was a chance. Not for absolution, he knew he was too far gone for that, but for something. Something other than the bitter taste of regret that was his constant companion. He settled beside her, adding more wood to the fire, the small space slowly filling with a marginal warmth. She didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just watched him with those dark, unreadable eyes. The blizzard howled for 2 days, imprisoning them in their shallow cave. Jedediah rationed their meager supplies, jerky, a handful of dried beans, and what little coffee remained. He melted snow for water, ensuring the girl drank, even when she seemed too listless to care. He learned her name was Ayasha, or something close to it, whispered in a voice as fragile as a bird's wing when he'd pointed to himself and said Jedediah, then pointed to her expectantly. She would lapse into long silences, staring into the flames, and Jedediah wondered what horrors she had witnessed to leave her so alone in such a desolate place. He tried to speak to her gently, simple words, but the language barrier was a vast chasm. Yet, a silent understanding began to form. When he shivered, she unconsciously pulled the edge of his duster, which he draped over her, a little further towards him. When he offered her a piece of jerky, she would break off the smallest portion, offering the larger piece back, her eyes questioning. He'd gently push her hand back, insisting she eat. On the third morning, the wind died down, and a pale, watery sun peeked through the dissipating clouds. The world outside was a transformed landscape of sculpted snowdrifts and glittering ice. It was beautiful, in a stark, deadly way. Their food was nearly gone. Ayasha, though still weak, seemed a little stronger. Color had returned to her cheeks, and the fear in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a watchful intelligence. As Jedediah prepared to venture out, checking his rifle and strapping on his snowshoes improvised from willow branches and strips of leather, Ayasha stirred. She pointed a small finger towards a cluster of low-growing, thorny bushes peeking through the snow near their shelter, then mind digging and eating. Jedediah, skeptical but willing to try anything, investigated. Beneath the snow, clinging to the frozen roots, were small, reddish tubers. He dug a few out, cleaned them, and tasted one cautiously. Earthy, slightly sweet. Edible. He looked at Ayasha with newfound respect. Her people knew this land, its secrets, its sustenance, in ways he never would. They spent the morning gathering the tubers, Ayasha directing him with gestures and soft sounds to the most promising spots. It was slow, cold work, but it yielded a small pile of precious food. Later, as they sat by the replenished fire, roasting the tubers, Ayasha did something that startled him. She reached out and touched the worn, scarred stock of his rifle, then looked at him, her expression unreadable. He wasn't sure what she meant by it. Fear? Curiosity? Or was it an understanding of the tool, of the violence it represented, a violence that had likely scarred her own young life? He simply nodded, his own expression grim. The rifle was a part of him, a grim necessity in this harsh land. That afternoon, as a fragile warmth seeped into their small shelter, Ayasha began to communicate more. Not with words, not yet, but with pictures. She found a charred stick from the edge of the fire and, on a relatively smooth patch of rock on the cave wall, she began to draw. Stick figures, crude but expressive. She drew a cluster of teepees, smoke rising from them, a village. Then, she drew taller figures, men on horses, wearing hats like his, carrying long guns. Their faces were drawn with harsh, angry lines. She drew fire engulfing the teepees, and small figures running, falling. Her hand trembled as she drew one small figure, smaller than the others, running away, alone, into a landscape of swirling lines that clearly represented the storm. Her eyes, when she looked up at Jedediah, were filled with a raw, visceral pain that made his chest ache. He didn't need words to understand the story of slaughter and escape. He'd seen its like before, been a part of it, a truth that burned like bile in his throat. So, her village was gone, destroyed by white men. Raiders, or perhaps even soldiers, though he prayed it wasn't the latter, not again. He gently placed a hand on her small shoulder. She flinched, then leaned into his touch almost imperceptibly. The silence in the cave was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Ayesha's quiet sniffles. He felt a cold rage build within him, directed at the perpetrators of such brutality, and at a world that allowed it. He also felt a profound sense of shame. His people, his kind, had done this. He had worn the blue uniform, ridden under the flag that, to Ayesha's people, often meant destruction. He looked at the drawing of the attackers. One figure was drawn larger than the others, a cruel slash for a mouth, a distinctive wide-brimmed hat. A leader? Jedediah's mind raced. Who would be out here, in this weather, committing such atrocities? Not regular cavalry, surely. Renegades? A posse drunk on hate and greed? He had to get her to safety. But where? Fort Laramie was too far, and likely wouldn't welcome her. The nearest settlement was Harmony Creek, a raw, struggling mining town a few days' ride south, assuming the passes weren't snowed in. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe there'd be a doctor, someone kind. Or maybe just more of the same prejudice that had destroyed her home. It was a gamble. But staying here meant starvation or freezing when the next storm hit. He looked at Ayesha, at the residue of terror still clinging to her, but also at the spark of resilience in her eyes. He owed her this chance. He owed himself this chance to do something right, for once. The decision made, Jedediah began preparations for their journey south. He reinforced his makeshift snowshoes and fashioned a smaller pair for Ayesha from willow withes and strips of his spare blanket. She watched him, her dark eyes solemn, occasionally offering a silent suggestion with a gesture, her innate understanding of survival in this landscape becoming increasingly apparent. He packed what remained of the tubers, the last of the jerky, and his dwindling ammunition. Bess, thankfully, had weathered the storm reasonably well, sheltered in a deeper part of the alcove Jedediah had found for her, and had been sustained by the bark of saplings he'd managed to uncover. The journey would be hard on her, but she was a sturdy mare. They set out at dawn, the snow crunching underfoot, the air biting but clear. Jedediah walked, leading Bess, with Ayesha perched atop the saddle, wrapped in most of their remaining blankets. He kept his rifle ready, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon. The landscape was deceptively beautiful, a vast expanse of white and blue, but danger lurked beneath its pristine surface, hidden crevasses, weakening ice over streams, and the ever-present threat of predators, both animal and human. Ayesha, despite her ordeal, proved to be an invaluable companion. She would point out faint game trails almost invisible to his eye, or subtle changes in the snow that indicated unstable ground. Once, she let out a small, sharp cry and pointed towards a copse of aspens. Jedediah saw nothing at first, then a flicker of movement. A pair of wolves, lean and hungry, watching them from the shadows. They hadn't scented them yet, the wind in their favor. Jedediah quietly guided Bess away, making a wide detour. Ayesha remained silent, but her small hand clutched his shoulder tightly until the danger was past. Evenings were spent huddled around a small, carefully concealed fire. He taught her a few more English words, fire, water, safe. She, in turn, taught him a word in her tongue that sounded like Manaya, which he gathered meant friend, or perhaps protector, by the way she looked at him when she said it, a hesitant trust dawning in her eyes. One afternoon, as they crossed a windswept ridge, Jedediah spotted them, tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks. Shod horses. Several of them, heading roughly south, the same direction they were going. And recently made. He knelt, examining them closely. The horses were ridden hard. He felt a prickle of unease. Coincidence? Or were these the men from Ayesha's drawings? The men who had destroyed her village? He looked back at Ayesha. She too was staring at the tracks, her small face pale, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. She understood. He put a finger to his lips, then urged Bess into a faster pace, moving towards the cover of a line of low hills. The quest for survival had just gained a new, more sinister urgency. They were no longer just battling the elements, they were potentially being hunted. The track spurred them onward, a grim reminder of the darkness that stalked this land. Jedediah pushed them harder, choosing more difficult, less obvious routes through broken country, hoping to throw off any potential pursuit. Ayesha, sensing the increased danger, was quiet and watchful, her small hand often resting on his arm as she rode, a silent offering of comfort or perhaps a plea for reassurance he wasn't sure he could give. 2 days later, as they navigated a narrow, snow-choked canyon, the ambush came. It wasn't the men whose tracks they'd seen, but something else, something that spoke of the desperation of the wilderness. A starved cougar, driven from its usual hunting grounds by the severe weather, launched itself from an outcrop of rock above them. Jedediah heard the scrape of claws on stone an instant before the tawny blur filled his vision. He reacted on pure instinct, shoving Bess and Ayesha sideways even as he drew his Colt. The big cat landed where he'd been a second before, snarling, its yellow eyes fixed on him. Bess reared, screaming in terror, Ayesha clinging on with surprising strength. Jedediah fired, the shot deafening in the confines of the canyon. The bullet struck the cougar in the shoulder, spinning it around with a yowl of pain and rage. It wasn't a killing shot. The cat gathered itself, wounded but still lethal, preparing for another lunge. Jedediah thumbed back the hammer for a second shot, but Ayesha suddenly cried out, pointing frantically behind the cougar, up the canyon wall. For a split second, Jedediah was distracted, glancing where she pointed. He saw nothing but snow and rock. It was enough. The cougar sprang. He threw himself to the side, the cat's claws raking his duster, tearing through fabric and drawing blood from his arm. He landed hard, his pistol skittering away in the snow. The cougar, momentarily overshooting, turned, its eyes burning. Before Jedediah could scramble for his weapon, Ayesha acted. With a cry that was more fury than fear, she slid from Bess's back, grabbed a heavy, snow-laden branch Jedediah had cut for firewood the night before, and swung it with all her might at the cougar's head as it prepared to pounce on the downed man. The blow was clumsy, lacking adult strength, but it connected with the side of the cougar's jaw, startling it, momentarily disorienting it. That precious second was all Jedediah needed. He lunged for his Colt, his fingers closing around the cold steel. He rolled, aimed, and fired. The shot caught the cougar in the chest. It stumbled, coughed, and collapsed, a tremor running through its powerful body before it lay still. Silence descended, heavy and ringing. Jedediah lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the pain in his arm a dull throb. Ayesha rushed to his side, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce protectiveness that astonished him. She touched his torn sleeve, her small fingers tracing the bloodstain. He managed a shaky grin. "Reckon you saved my hide, little one." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. A tiny, tremulous smile touched her lips. This was a different kind of survival, a different kind of bond. They were no longer just a man and a foundling, they were partners, watching each other's backs in a world determined to swallow them whole. The encounter with the cougar left Jedediah with a nasty set of gashes on his arm and a deeper appreciation for Ayesha's courage. She tended to his wounds with a surprising gentleness, using clean snow to wash away the blood and then binding it tightly with strips torn from her own spare tunic, her small hand surprisingly deft. They reached the outskirts of Harmony Creek 2 days later, a straggling collection of rough-hewn cabins and muddy tracks clinging to the side of a stark, snow-dusted mountain. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, a stark contrast to the pristine wilderness they'd left behind. It was a grim, uninviting place, but it represented their best hope. As they rode down the main thoroughfare, a generous term for the rutted, half-frozen morass of mud and ice, heads turned. Faces peered from behind grimy windows, and men loitering outside the saloon fell silent, their eyes hard and suspicious. Jedediah felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He knew this look. It was the look of fear, of distrust, of ingrained prejudice. Ayesha, sensing the hostile stares, pressed closer to him, her small hand gripping his coat. He dismounted in front of what passed for a general store, a crudely lettered sign proclaiming Henderson's Mercantile Stay Here, he murmured to Ayesha, placing a reassuring hand on her arm before heading inside. The store was dim, smelling of dust, cured meats, and unwashed bodies. A portly man with suspicious eyes and a greasy apron looked up from behind the counter. "What can I do for you, stranger?" Henderson asked, his voice flat. "Looking for a doctor," Jedediah said. "And perhaps some information. There are lawmen in this town." Henderson snorted. "Doc Weatherby's usually at the saloon this time of day, if he ain't too drunk. As for law, Sheriff Miller tries, but mostly we look after our own." He glanced past Jedediah towards the door, where Ayesha was a small, visible silhouette against the weak daylight. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "That your ward?" The word was laden with disapproval. "She needs help," Jedediah said, keeping his voice even. "Her people were attacked." "She's the only one I found." Henderson's expression hardened further. "Attacked, you say? Or run off from her reservation? We've had trouble with renegades lately. Stealin' stock, scarin' the folks." Jedediah felt his temper fray. "She's a child. She's seen things no child should see." Just then, the door creaked open and a tall, gaunt man in a stained suit entered, weaving slightly. "Doc Weatherby, presumably." Before Jedediah could speak, another figure filled the doorway, blocking out the light. This man was different. He was large, dressed in expensive, though trail-worn, clothes, a silver-starred badge gleaming on his vest that was definitely not a local sheriff's. He had cold, pale eyes and a cruel set to his mouth that Jedediah recognized with a sickening lurch. It was the face from Ayesha's drawings, the leader of the attackers. The man's gaze swept the store, lingered on Jedediah, then fixed on Ayesha, who had shrunk back against Bess. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well, now," the man drawled, his voice like stones grinding together. "Look what the storm blew in. Silas Blackwood, at your service. And I believe you have something that belongs to me." Silas Blackwood. The name sent a chill down Jedediah's spine, colder than any blizzard. This was him, the monster from Ayesha's nightmares, now made flesh, standing before them with an air of absolute authority and menace. Ayesha, seeing Blackwood, let out a small, choked sound and tried to hide behind Bess, her tiny body trembling violently. Blackwood's smile widened, a humorless baring of teeth. "The little Apache whelp," he said, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence of the store. "Thought she'd gotten clean away. Seems I underestimated her resilience." Or perhaps, his cold eyes flicked to Jedediah, she had helped. Henderson, the storekeeper, looked nervous, glancing between Blackwood and Jedediah. Doc Weatherby seemed to sober up slightly, his gaze wary. "Now, Mr. Blackwood," Henderson began, placatingly, "this fella just rode in. Said he found her." Blackwood cut him off with a wave of his hand. "She's a fugitive. Part of a band of hostiles responsible for raiding settlements up north. I've been tracking them for weeks. She needs to be returned to the authorities, my authorities." Jedediah stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Blackwood and the doorway where Ayesha cowered. "She's a child, Blackwood. Her village was wiped out. I saw the signs." Blackwood chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Signs can be misleading, friend. Those villagers were murderers and thieves. She's likely as savage as the rest of them. Just playing possum." His eyes, like chips of ice, bored into Jedediah. "I'd advise you to step aside. This doesn't concern you." Jedediah's hand instinctively drifted towards his Colt. "She's under my protection." The air crackled. Several rough-looking men who had been loitering outside, clearly Blackwood's men, now began to edge closer to the store entrance, their expressions hard and expectant. Harmony Creek, which had seemed merely unwelcoming, now felt like a trap. Some of the townsfolk who had gathered, drawn by the confrontation, watched with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. A few looked uneasy, their gazes shifting towards Ayesha, then to Blackwood's confident sneer. "Your protection." Blackwood scoffed. "You have no authority here. I, on the other hand, am deputized by territorial marshals to bring these renegades to justice. Or what passes for it?" He took a step closer. "Hand her over, and you can ride out of here with no trouble." Jedediah stood his ground. He thought of his past, the orders he'd followed, the faces he couldn't forget. He looked at Ayesha, her small face streaked with fresh tears, her eyes pleading. This was his line in the sand. "No," he said, his voice low and steady. "She stays with me." Blackwood's face darkened. "Then you've just made a fatal mistake, friend." He nodded curtly to his men, who began to spread out, their hands hovering near their own weapons. The main street of Harmony Creek, muddy and desolate, was about to become a battleground. The standoff in front of Henderson's mercantile escalated with terrifying speed. Blackwood's men, 6 of them, fanned out, their expressions grim, weapons readily accessible. Townsfolk scattered, seeking cover in doorways and alleys, their initial curiosity replaced by stark fear. Only a few hardy souls remained, watching from a safer distance, their faces pale. Jedediah knew he was outmanned and outgunned. His Colt felt heavy in his hand, Bess and Ayesha vulnerable behind him. "This is your last chance, Thorn, or whatever your name is," Blackwood snarled, his hand resting on the butt of his own ornate pistol. "Don't die for a savage." Jedediah didn't reply. His focus was absolute, calculating angles, potential cover, the movements of each man. He had to create an opportunity, any opportunity. Ayesha, hidden behind Bess, suddenly let out a sharp, high-pitched cry, a sound that wasn't just fear, but also a signal. She pointed frantically down the street, towards the ramshackle livery stable. For a moment, everyone, including Blackwood's men, hesitated, their attention drawn by the sudden sound and gesture. It was the briefest of distractions, but Jedediah seized it. He grabbed Bess's reins with his left hand, fired a shot into the dirt at the feet of the nearest gunman with his right, and yelled, "Run, Ayesha! Livery!" He pulled Bess hard, spinning the startled mare to provide a momentary shield as Ayesha, small and agile, darted from behind the horse and sprinted towards the livery stable, not looking back. Blackwood roared in anger, "Get the girl! Shoot the man!" Gunfire erupted. Bullets splintered the wooden facade of the mercantile, whined past Jedediah's head. He returned fire, aiming to suppress rather than kill, buying Ayesha precious seconds. He saw her slip through the open doors of the livery just as one of Blackwood's men raised his rifle to take aim at her retreating form. Jedediah's next shot was precise, hitting the man's shoulder, making him scream and drop his weapon. Using Bess as moving cover, Jedediah backed towards the alleyway beside the mercantile. A bullet grazed Bess's flank, and the mare screamed, rearing. Jedediah fought to control her, firing again at the advancing gunman. He saw Doc Weatherby, surprisingly spry, dragging the wounded gunman into the relative safety of the saloon. Henderson, the storekeeper, had vanished. Jedediah reached the mouth of the alley. He gave Bess a hard slap on the rump, sending her galloping riderless down the street, away from the main concentration of gunfire. A diversion. He then plunged into the narrow alley, emerging at the back of the buildings, and raced towards the livery stable, hoping Ayesha had found cover. The fight was far from over. Blackwood and his men were fanning out, intending to surround the stable. Jedediah reloaded on the run, his mind a whirlwind of tactics and fear for the child he'd sworn to protect. He had to get to Ayesha, to make a stand. His redemption wouldn't come cheap. Jedediah reached the rear of the livery stable, a dilapidated structure smelling of old hay and manure. He slipped through a loose plank in the wall, his Colt leading the way. Inside, it was gloomy, shafts of dusty light lancing through cracks in the roof. "Ayesha," he whispered hoarsely. A small whimper came from the hayloft. He saw her small face peer down, eyes wide with terror. "Stay there." "Stay down," he commanded, then scanned the stable. It offered poor cover, but it was all they had. He could hear Blackwood's men shouting outside, coordinating their approach. They knew he was in here. The front doors burst open, and two of Blackwood's men charged in, guns blazing. Jedediah fired from behind a stack of old barrels, driving them back. One clutched his leg, cursing, and his companion dragged him out. This bought him a moment. He scrambled up the rickety ladder to the hayloft. Ayesha was huddled deep in the hay, trying to make herself invisible. "They're coming," he said, his voice grim. "We fight." He positioned himself near a small window overlooking the street, while Ayesha found a spot where she could see the back entrance. He handed her his spare ammunition pouch. "If I need these, you give them to me. Understand?" She nodded, her small face set with a courage that belied her years. The siege began in earnest. Gunshots echoed from all sides as Blackwood's men probed their defenses. Splinters flew from the wooden walls. Jedediah returned fire sparingly, making each shot count. He knew they couldn't hold out forever. Suddenly, from the street, came a different sound, not gunfire, but shouting. A new voice, authoritative. "Blackwood! Hold your fire! This is Sheriff Miller." Jedediah risked a glance. A harried-looking man with a tin star was trying to reason with Blackwood, who looked furious at the interruption. A few townsfolk, emboldened by the sheriff's arrival, had crept out, watching. Then, a window of the saloon shattered, and Doc Weatherby, rifle in hand, fired a shot over the heads of Blackwood's men. "Leave them alone, Blackwood! That child's innocent," he yelled. More astonishingly, Henderson the storekeeper appeared in his doorway, holding an ancient-looking shotgun. "This ain't right, Blackwood! This ain't justice!" The tide was turning, not with a flood, but with hesitant drops of courage. Blackwood, seeing his absolute control fracturing, snarled. "They're mine! Stay out of this!" He raised his pistol towards the loft. But before he could fire, Ayesha, seeing his intent, did something unexpected. She grabbed a pitchfork that was leaning against the hay bales and, with a desperate cry, shoved it hard through a gap in the floorboards, aiming for Blackwood below. It didn't connect seriously, but the tine scraped his arm, making him yelp in surprise and pain, his shot going wild. In that instant of chaos, Jedediah leaned out and fired. His bullet struck Blackwood's gun hand. The pistol clattered to the ground. Blackwood howled, clutching his bleeding hand. His men hesitated, looking from their wounded leader to the now armed townsfolk and the determined sheriff. Their fight was gone. The whole town, it seemed, or at least a brave part of it, had finally found its voice. Jedediah kept his rifle trained on Blackwood, his heart pounding. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the raw tension of the aftermath. Down below, Sheriff Miller, flanked by Doc Weatherby and a surprisingly resolute Henderson, advanced on Blackwood. Tears were streaming down Ayesha's face, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming release of terror and a dawning, fragile hope. Jedediah reached out and gently pulled her close. He looked down at the street, at the faces of the townsfolk. Many were openly weeping, some from relief, some from shame at their earlier inaction, some from a shared, sudden understanding of the brutality they had almost allowed, and the courage they had just witnessed. The whole town, indeed, seemed to be crying, not just for the child, or the stranger who defended her, but for a moment of unexpected grace in a harsh and unforgiving world. Jedediah knew this wasn't the end of all their troubles, but it was a beginning. A beginning forged in fire and washed clean by the tears of a town that had found its conscience.